Hello everybody, my name's Al Story and welcome to Real Life. We're so glad you could join us today. I have a question for you today. As you look at the nation we live in, is it easy to see that there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, discord? We've had quite a year of it, haven't we? Dealing with the coronavirus has been a turbulent ride for us. And of course, we have great division in our country with hateful words seemingly everywhere we turn on two different sides. Anger, impatience, and cruelty are also abundantly present. So do you feel good about where the United States of America is at as a nation right now? Or do you, like so many others, fear where we're headed? Do you feel that we need to change our direction before it's too late? Well, if you're like so many in this country who feel like we're descending into a semi-barbaric state, I have good news for you today. We're going to be looking at how the Lord can bring great change to a people, so stay with me. Now, I'm sure that unless you've been living under a rock lately in the middle of nowhere, you know what's going on in our nation. There's never been a time prior in our lifetime where our nation was more sharply divided, and the common denominator present in seemingly every situation and topic being discussed is anger and hate, with people spewing out poison with their words towards others who don't share their point of view. Folks, this is not the way it's supposed to be. We need to change. And we need to recognize and accept the fact that the change needs to occur here in our nation with us. A few years ago, a phrase was made quite popular for a time by a certain public figure who borrowed it from an African community. Well, the title for today's message takes that phrase and adds a truth to it that makes it more accurate. So I know that when you see this screen, you know what I'm talking about. You've heard the phrase, "It takes a village." And I'm not sure that I agree with that totally. I can understand a little bit of reinforcement, but if you don't have the right foundation, then the village isn't going to help the child. So instead of it taking a village, it takes God's word to change a village and to change our world. And that's really where we need to be headed. And you know what? The problems that we're facing right now, they're nothing new. They've been going on for thousands of years. Pretty much since mankind came into existence, we've had our problems getting along. In fact, Jesus Christ encountered social injustices and prejudice too, as well as some racism. And that's what we're going to be looking at today here. How well aware, he was well aware of the spiritual darkness that's found in each one of us that directs us in how we live out our lives. So let's see how Jesus brought about needed change to a country. Maybe then we can understand what needs to happen first here to change the ills in our nation. Now you need to understand that Jesus was a man on the move. He was constantly going wherever the Father directed him, and he traveled quite often between the regions of Galilee, where Nazareth and Capernaum are, the northern regions, and then Judea, which is the southern region, where Jerusalem and the Jordan River are. In between these regions lay another region called Samaria. Now the Samaritans were greatly despised by the Jews because the Samaritans were actually Jews who had settled there generations earlier and had intermarried with people of other nations. Sounds like a racial thing, but I think there's a little something more else going on here. The problem with this situation, or the fact that they'd intermarried with these other people, is not because of other races, but these other nations were worshiping other gods. So it was a spiritual issue, and the Jews were led away from worshiping the one true God, the God of the Jews, Yahweh, the Lord. So the Jews who lived in Judea held these prejudices against the Samaritans and openly discriminated against them. They thought of them as half-breeds and considered them defiled or unclean, unholy. Keep that in mind as we look at Jesus' travels through Samaria. This oppressive hostility or prejudice on the part of the Jews was so extreme that some Jews would rather go miles and miles out of their way than pass through the land of those defiled Samaritans as they traveled to Galilee or some other regions north of Judea. Well, Jesus had no intention of going out of his way to go around Samaria on his way to Galilee. He went into Samaria and stopped in a town called Sychar. And when he got there, it's around noontime, and it's hot. If you live in the desert like we do, you know what it's like at noon, and especially if it's not the winter time. So it's hot, it's noon, he's tired, he's thirsty, and he finds a place to sit down by a well. So he sits down to rest. And a Samaritan woman very shortly afterward comes to the well to draw some water from the well to take back to her home for her family's water needs. At this point, Jesus initiates a conversation. He asks a question. He actually makes a request. He says, "Could you give me a drink, please?" So, like when you're bringing the water up, could I have a drink? I'd appreciate it. And so when he did that, he initiated a conversation. He asked the question, made a request, and this was a shocking thing that he had done. One that really got her attention. And she was so shocked, that it's like, "Are you kidding me? You're actually talking to me?" So the Samaritan woman, in her shock, responds to Jesus and asks him a question. And she says, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink since I'm a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." So the fact that Jesus would talk to her at all was shocking. Now, there are actually two reasons why it was so unusual and unexpected for him to talk to her. First of all, again, she was a Samaritan, a person detested by the Jews, because the undefiled Jews living in Judea judged them for their spiritual uncleanness or impurity. They were judging them for that because they intermarried with people from other nations that worshipped other gods, and these Jews who did that ended up abandoning the Lord as their God. So these other nations could have been a little bit of racism, maybe, but also absolutely it was a spiritual issue here going on. But no matter what, it was a very divisive thing. Now the second thing was the fact she was a woman. And by and large in that culture at that time, women were not regarded highly. They weren't much better than a piece of furniture. I mean, isn't it amazing we live in America, the United States now, that issues like that, we have nothing like that. The women were regarded about like furniture. So she actually had two strikes against her. One, she was a Samaritan. Number two, she was a woman. So how would you like to feel like that every day and in every situation? Doesn't sound like a great setup. So Jesus talking to her was really a shocking development. So what we have here is a person very concerned with the social issues that cause division and discrimination in her country. So how does Jesus respond to her socio-political question? He doesn't. He changes the subject, basically ignoring her question about this issue because he has something far more important to discuss with her. This is not the only time that Jesus did this. He also did it earlier with Nicodemus. I'm not going to go into that today, though. But we need to understand something today. Make no mistake about it. God cares deeply about us and about you. And He cares deeply about our social and cultural problems with evil or with injustices. But He understands that they are not the sickness causing the problem. These are the symptoms of the underlying sickness that need to be healed that are causing the problems. That make sense? Okay. So the issue really is a spiritual one that needs to be addressed so that when that issue is resolved, it will address the social problems. So Jesus then makes a thought-provoking statement that got her attention and curiosity going. So now He has her asking questions, and she hears about something she would very much like to have. And so in verse 10, He says, "If you only knew." How many times have you heard that expression? If you only knew. If you only had a clue. And He wasn't putting her down, but I'm just saying that's how we'd say it today. If you only knew the gift God has for you. I don't know about you, but that tells me something right there, some good news. God, there is a God. He must love me because He's got a gift for me. And so if you only knew the gift God has for you and who you're speaking to, you'd ask me. and I would give you living water. And so she responded to him saying, well, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. So Jesus is speaking on a spiritual level. She's still relating on a physical level. So she says, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep, so where are you going to get this living water? She goes, you're not greater than our father Jacob, are you? Who gave us the well and drank of it himself as well as the sons and his cattle. Now Jacob was the ancestor of the people of Israel. In fact, they called them the children of Israel. Well, the Samaritans at one time had been part of the children of Israel before they intermarried and were excluded. But we see here that Jacob, or Israel, you're not greater than Israel, are you? The father of our nation. And then Jesus has a really interesting new phase of the conversation. Looking at verses 13 through 15. By the way, our passage today is in John chapter 4. I apologize for not telling you sooner. That's John, the Gospel of John, chapter 4. And we've been looking at it. And right now we're going to look at verses 13 through 15. Okay? So there it says, Jesus answered her and said to her, everyone who drinks this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks the water that I will give him will never thirst. But the water that I give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Well, that sounds like a pretty good deal, especially when you're thinking on the physical level and you're still thinking about on a physical level, it's like, wow, I'll never get thirsty again. I need some of that water. That's better than Costco. We don't know what was going through her mind, but she's obviously still thinking of the physical, and he's, again, still referring to the spiritual. So she says, where do I get that? And after she tells him that she'd very much like to have this water, where whoever has it will never thirst again, he then tells her to go get her husband. He says, go get your husband and come back here with him. Here's a question for you. Have you ever made a mistake? That's a tough question, isn't it? And if we're honest, we got to think about that. In fact, we don't have to think long to realize, oh yeah, I made lots of mistakes. But have you made a big mistake, serious mistakes? Have you done something seriously wrong? We see people every day on TV who've done terrible things, haven't we? We see murderers and rapists, embezzlers, or perhaps a businessman who committed a felony like fraud. Maybe even you might have been involved, maybe you were drinking or you were high and you had a hit and run and you ran from it instead of facing the accident and the consequences, did a hit and run. These are terrible things we live with here. And of course, being caught in these crimes can bring great shame. But there are other things people can be very ashamed of. You don't have to kill somebody to be very ashamed of something. Perhaps your marriage failed. You know, if you hadn't seen somebody in a long time and said, hey, how's it going, blah, blah, blah. And, well, you know, that marriage that everybody thought was going to be so wonderful, well, it didn't work out. My wife left me for another man. And so the marriage failed. Or maybe you failed to become a great success after everybody said, oh, most likely to succeed. Well, it didn't turn out so well, and you've been struggling to make ends meet ever since high school. And so you failed to become that great success. And then you had to deal with someone asking you how you were doing or assuming you had it all together. And that's really about what Jesus was doing here. He says, go, get your husband. Well, this woman knew failure. She knew failure. And she wasn't very proud of how her life had gone to this point. Maybe some of you can relate to that. I know my life's not perfect. In fact, I would imagine that she was pretty ashamed of how her life had gone. So when Jesus told her to go get her husband, she might have begun by responding to his request with, I don't have a husband. And without batting an eye, Jesus said to her, that's right. He's not being hateful. He's just acknowledging he knows the truth. That's right. You've done the right thing, correctly telling me. Don't hide it from me. Be honest with God. It's okay to be honest with God. God already knows what's going on in your life anyway. Why not address it and admit it and confess it and get rid of it? And so you did the right thing by telling me, correctly telling me, that I have no husband. For you've had 5 husbands. And the one whom you now have is not your husband at all. So you spoke honestly, telling the truth when you said this. So she didn't hide the truth, and he was affirming her for that. And he closed that very embarrassing topic very affirmingly, didn't he? He wasn't condemning her. He addressed the sin. He addressed the need. But even though he did that, it still could produce a very awkward moment, right? I mean, I think you've felt those before, been involved in them or witnessed them. So here's a question. Why would Jesus go there? Why would Jesus ask her something like that and put her in such an awkward situation if he's trying to build a friendship with her? The reason why is because he wanted her to understand he was not your average Joe. He wasn't some new stranger to town. He's just, just your average Joe. He's way beyond that. She was seeing something far greater than what was unfolding right in front of her. Make sense? Okay. Well, let's go ahead. So she began to understand that Jesus was not your ordinary visitor to town. She concluded that he must be a prophet to know all that she'd done. And so as we look in verses 19 through 26, again, still staying there right there in chapter 4, here's what it says. Beginning in verse 19. It says, the woman said to him, after he told her about the fact she'd had 5 husbands and stuff. And so after he said that to her, she says, Sir, I am understanding that you're a prophet. Our fathers, and so she begins immediately by talking about something else or addressing another issue or maybe some concerns of the people, maybe getting some answers. So the first thing she says was, our fathers worshipped in this mountain. We worship in the mountain here. And you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. And Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship who you do not know. We worship who we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So she's asking, well, where's the proper place to worship? Is it on our mountain, or is it in Jerusalem? And Jesus says, you don't have to worry about it. God's spirit. God is humongous. I know humongous is such a weak term, probably outdated too. But he's so great, so incomprehensibly great, that just in a small illustration of who he is and how great he is, he says the earth is his footstool. And God was saying that thousands of years before this conversation ever took place, that the earth is his footstool. Therefore, he is not to be limited to one place to come together to worship him. You can worship God wherever you are. But the second part of that is that true worship, if you really want to have a meaningful encounter with God, you must come to him in truth. With true worship. It is true worship that the Lord's pleased with, and it takes place not in the temple or the mountain. It takes place in your heart. It's a matter of the heart. And any other worship besides the worship that's from the heart is just going through the motions. And you probably have been to church and you've gone through the motions. Or you've seen other people who go through the motions every week. They just don't have a meaningful relationship with God, and they're not there to worship him in a face-to-face encounter. So they're not worshiping him with their spirits. They're not worshiping him in truth. But anything other than that's just going through the motions. It's not true. Nothing is occurring internally in the heart and the spirit of the individual or the group. But you can worship the Lord with all your heart, anytime, anywhere, and in complete honesty, because God knows. And God will honor that. Okay? The second thing she talked about was, well, the Messiah is going to come, and when he comes, he'll be able to explain all these things to us. And then Jesus really had a shocker for her. He said, you're talking to him. I am the Messiah. So he boldly shared with her just who he is, and we too should boldly share with others about Jesus. So about that time, after Jesus having this meaningful discussion with this woman from the well in Samaria, the 12 disciples that had been his regular followers, very committed to him, they'd gone into town to get some food so they could eat. Then they came back with the food, and as they're talking, the woman quietly leaves her water pot and then goes into the city to the men who are probably some of the leaders of the town, and she said to them, "Come, see a man who told me all the things I've ever done." You ever had a stranger do that before? No. Nobody can do that. Well, unless they're God. And then, of course, so she says, "Come. This is crazy. I can't believe this. It's amazing. This guy told me everything I've ever done. Could he be the Messiah?" And she's asking that because she already heard from him that he was the Messiah. So she goes to them, she shares with them, and you know what? As a result of her sharing with them and inviting them to come check it out, they come out of the city and they go to Jesus. That's an important lesson for us to learn. Here's a woman who's considered a social or moral failure. Certainly a marital failure. Might have been looked down on by a lot of people. Not exactly the upper echelon of her culture, her town, her society. And yet she went and told the people about Jesus. So here's another question. Where do we begin? Where would I begin? Or where would you begin? You might be asking that question. Where do I begin? I hear all about all these needs, but nobody tells me how to do it. Well, here's where we start. Where do you begin to take helpful steps to help a nation or world change for the better when they're struggling with hatred and anger and prejudice and everything else? Jesus began to change the world by changing people, changing people's hearts with his good news, which changed the people's lives and how they saw and understood life. And he did it one person at a time. He did it one person at a time. You know what? That's where we all need to begin. That's where we all need to begin, but we don't stop there. As we'll see in our next part in this lesson, one person is just the beginning. It's definitely not the end of our work to bring about the needed change that our world desperately needs and feels. Because there are many people today, if you ask them, do you feel like America's going in the right direction? Many of them say, no, I don't. We're worried about that. We don't know what to do, but we're worried about it. And so we definitely have more to do than just talk about life to one person. So do you understand how badly the world needs change for the better? In a world full of strife and division and hatred? Can you see it all around you? Especially as you watch the TV news, the evening news? Well, if you do, then go and tell others what Christ has done for you. Jesus Christ changed the world. Isn't that what we want? Don't we want to change the world? Well, then if we do, then we need to understand, follow Jesus' model. Jesus changed the world. One person changed the world forever. One person at a time. And eventually, the whole world was changed. And nobody's ever done anything like that before, like Jesus. And it was done by his work in their lives. So I want to close today just by saying, you know what? Go and do the same. You do it, and I'll do it, and let's see if we can't change the world together. All right? All right. Well, you take care. We're out of time, so I'm going to take off. You guys take care, and God bless, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.